This presentation looks at how Canada's GDP relates to international travel. We're comparing GDP measured in millions of Canadian dollars with the number of international trips to Canada from 1989 to 2019. Over 30 years, we can see how economic growth might influence travel patterns for both Canadians and visitors from abroad.
As GDP grows, Canadians generally have more disposable income, so they often take more vacations. Non-residents may also visit more because a stronger economy usually means better airports, attractions, and public transportation. Our data spans 1989 to 2019. GDP is our independent variable and international trips are the dependent variable. We split the travelers into two groups, non-residents entering Canada and Canadian residents returning, to see how each group responds to changes in GDP.
Travel and tourism are a major part of Canada's economy, contributing billions of dollars each year. Both residents and visitors spend money on hotels, transportation, food, and attractions. By looking at these two groups separately, we can see how economic growth affects domestic and international travel patterns.
Understanding this relationship helps governments and businesses plan for tourism demand, manage resources, and support the economy. For example, tourism boards, travel agencies, hotels, and airlines can use this data to predict trends, plan marketing strategies, set budgets, and improve services. Policymakers can also use it to decide infrastructures projects like airport expansions or better public transit that support travelers.
Next, we compare Canadian residents returning to Canada with non-resident travelers in January. Using the median, about 4.1 million Canadians returned, while around 1.77 million international visitors arrived. This shows that domestic travel is more than twice the size of international travel in January. We use the median instead of the mean because the data is slightly skewed, giving a better representation of a typical year for both groups.
Looking at the histogram for non-residents, the distribution is bimodal and positively skewed. There are two peaks, one from 1.25 million to 1.5 million travelers, and another from 1.75 million to 2 million. The tail stretches towards higher values up to around 2.75 million, showing that most years fall near the two peaks while a few years had unusually high travel.
For Canadian residents, the data is also positively skewed. Most values fall between 3 and 4.5 million, with a median of 4.1 million. There are two peaks, one in the middle and one slightly to the left. There's a tail on the right with a value just above 6 million. This shows that while most years are consistent, there is some variation at the higher end.
Based on the box and whisker plot for non-total resident travelers entering Canada in January, there are no outliers because all values fall within the whiskers. This indicates that the number of non-resident travelers in January remain relatively consistent across the years, with variations but no extreme highs or lows.
Based on the box and whisker plot for total Canadian residents, there are no outliers because all values fall within the whiskers as well. This indicates that the number of Canadian residents remains relatively consistent across the years with some variation but no extreme highs or lows. There's a value at just over 6 million, but is not considered an outlier as it passes the outlier check using the outlier formula.
Looking at the averages and the variability, residents have much higher yearly average, about 4.15 million compared to the non-residents at 1.77 million. Resident numbers also vary with a standard deviation of 813,922, while non-resident varies by 455,514. In simple terms, this means residents contribute more to travel totals, but their numbers change more from year to year, whereas non-resident numbers are lower but more stable.
Next, we examined correlations with GDP. For Canadian residents, the correlation is almost zero, meaning GDP doesn't really affect how many residents travel. For non-residents, there's a moderate negative correlation, showing that as GDP rises, slightly fewer international visitors come in. In plain language, domestic travel stays fairly steady, while international travel reacts a bit to economic changes.
Finally, let's talk about data validity. The dataset comes from Stats Canada in its archives, so it hasn't been updated recently. However, it was reliable at the time, adhering to strict government standards. Over the decade, it has allowed us to see long-term trends in both domestic and international travel. Some assumptions were made, like treating GDP as an indicator of economic health, but these are reasonable. Overall, the data is strong enough to provide useful insight into travel patterns and how they relate to the economy.
In conclusion, Canada's GDP influences international travel slightly, but domestic travel remains relatively stable. Understanding these patterns helps businesses and governments plan and ensures resources are used effectively. Thank you for watching.